This is an exceptionally controversial and critically acclaimed suspense film, and it stands as one of the most shocking movies I have ever encountered. The narrative twists relentlessly, leaving its audience utterly stunned, while the conclusion is simultaneously unforeseen and yet feels completely inevitable. In 1994, a news bulletin announced the arrest of a professor named David for the brutal rape and murder of his female colleague. 6 years later, the local court finally sentenced David to death, with his execution scheduled for that Friday, a mere 4 days away. A newspaper editor was watching the report with keen interest when he abruptly received a call from a man identifying himself as David's personal lawyer, who specifically demanded that female journalist Betsy be the one to conduct the interview. The stipulations were that the meetings would occur from Tuesday to Thursday afternoons, and the newspaper had to pay $500,000 for the exclusive story. Betsy was confused about her selection, and the editor clarified it was likely due to her prior protection of a source in a prostitution case, for which she had served 7 days in jail without uttering a single word. Furthermore, why would a man on death row agree to interviews in the final 3 days of his life and demand such an exorbitant fee? There had to be explosively newsworthy material involved. Although the editor was hesitant to part with the money, he knew he could not pass up a story of such national significance. Consequently, Betsy and her assistant rented a car, departed New York and headed toward the prison. During the drive, they discussed David's alleged crime, observing that his fingerprints had been discovered at the scene and his DNA was found inside the victim. By every account, David was a convicted killer. Yet, it was deeply perplexing because David was a man of formidable intelligence, having received a Rhodes Scholarship to Harvard and serving as a philosophy professor at the University of Austin. How could a social elite commit such a senseless mistake, engaging in rape and murder and thereby obliterating his own future? As they conversed, their car suddenly malfunctioned, forcing them to pull over for an inspection. While the assistant went to use the restroom, a mysterious cowboy stopped nearby, and Betsy, feeling distinctly uneasy, quickly called her assistant back. Perhaps the cowboy sensed their wariness, for he simply started his car and drove away. The next morning, Betsy and her assistant completed the 2,700-mile journey to the Texas prison where David was held. They navigated intense security protocols before the warden personally escorted them into the high-security death row wing. Betsy noticed the lecherous stares from other inmates and assumed David would be similar. But upon first sight, he did not resemble a rapist or a murderer. Betsy directly inquired why he had requested her. David explained that her renowned professional ethics made her the only logical choice. He then stated that his execution was set for Friday and that he desired someone to properly record and reconstruct the true narrative of his case. Thus began a profoundly tragic and compelling story. 6 years prior, David was still a professor at the University of Austin, delivering dynamic philosophy lectures that were always packed and deeply thought-provoking. In one class, he proposed that to judge a person, one should not evaluate how much desire they fulfilled, but whether they understood self-sacrifice and respected the lives of others. After class, a female student approached him, stating she would do anything for a superior grade. Confronted with this overt sexual, David maintained his professional boundaries and calmly walked away. That evening, at a school party, he learned from colleagues that the student had been expelled. At the time, David knew his wife frequently traveled to Spain. In reality, however, he was himself involved in an affair with a Spanish woman. He shed his typically composed demeanor, telling crude jokes and becoming heavily intoxicated at the gathering. When he stepped away to the restroom, the student appeared, professing her admiration and claiming her earlier proposition was merely a plea for attention. Perhaps due to the alcohol, David tore her clothes and left bite marks on her body. The next day, a haggard David met his friend Cons, the very woman he would later be accused of murdering. Both were dedicated death penalty abolition activists who often strategized for their cause. That day, David was scheduled to debate the Texas governor live on television regarding the abolition of the death penalty. Cons had prepared extensive research materials for him. Initially, David seemed composed, cornering the governor with logical arguments, but he gradually fell into a rhetorical trap. Cons, watching with disappointment, recognized the debate was lost. As anticipated, the governor countered David's points, declaring that if David could name one wrongly convicted death row inmate, he would immediately submit a proposal to abolish the death penalty. David was left speechless, devoid of evidence to refute the challenge. What could have been a pivotal moment for their cause turned into a disaster due to David's own impulsiveness and arrogance. As he tried to explain himself to Cons, 2 police officers suddenly blocked their path, arresting him for alleged rape. It turned out the incident from the previous night was the student's act of revenge. She had deliberately left evidence on herself and leveled a false accusation. However, before the situation could escalate further, she withdrew the charges and vanished. At that point, the prison guard announced the visiting period was over, and Betsy concluded the first interview. As she departed, David told her the student later sent a postcard confessing, indicating the entire rape allegation had been fabricated. Betsy wondered why David had shared this memory. Could the subsequent murder accusation also be a false charge? As they started their car to leave, the mysterious cowboy appeared again. Who was he and why was he following Betsy? The next morning, a heavy rain fell over the Texas highway, casting a darker shadow over an already grim case. With a few hours remaining before the next interview, Betsy decided to first visit the crime scene. This was the home of the victim, Cons, which had since become a minor macabre tourist attraction. The woman in charge explained that touring the scene required a $20 fee, and for an additional $50, one could even reenact the crime as the victim. Cons had been discovered dead in the kitchen, lying naked on the floor. Based on the evidence, the killer's method was exceptionally brutal. He had first handcuffed Cons with her hands behind her back, then forced her to swallow the key, covered her head with a plastic bag, and ultimately caused her death by suffocation. Betsy noticed a tripod nearby, suggesting the crime had potentially been recorded. Strangely, the police never found any tape near the sink. There were rubber gloves, typically used for washing dishes, which the police believed were tools employed in the crime. But oddly, while the killer supposedly wore gloves, David's fingerprints were found on the plastic bag. Betsy and her assistant gasped in unison. This David was either a profoundly twisted individual or he was being deliberately framed. After leaving the crime scene, they ate a meal at a local restaurant, both unsettled by the bizarre circumstances of Khan's death. Suddenly, the mysterious cowboy appeared yet again. He seemed alert, paused briefly upon seeing them, and then departed once more. Betsy then proceeded to the prison for the second scheduled interview. Upon learning that Betsy had visited the crime scene, David introduced the concept of the beginning of freedom torture. He explained that the manner of Khan's death mirrored a brutal police interrogation technique, forcing a prisoner to swallow handcuff keys and experience suffocation. Knowing the key to freedom was inside them doubled their despair, instantly crushing their will to resist. David added that he had taught this very concept in his classes, so even if he were guilty, he would never have utilized that method, and he certainly would not have carelessly left his fingerprints behind. Everything indicated someone was setting him up. Furthermore, the tripod at the scene suggested the killer had recorded the crime intentionally, leaving it to imply that David's key to freedom was hidden somewhere. Betsy began piecing things together, though she did not take David's words entirely at face value. As he continued his story, the once clear case grew increasingly murky. 6 years ago, after being falsely accused, David's life and career were utterly devastated. Even though the female student had dropped the charges, everyone still perceived him as a rapist, assuming the student had only withdrawn out of fear of his authority. His wife seized the opportunity to file for divorce and took their child to live in Spain, selling their stateside home to split the assets. His son left behind his favorite toy for David, which shattered David's heart. Simultaneously, David received an official notice of dismissal from the university, cementing everyone's judgment. Overnight, a respected professor became a universally reviled criminal. Desperate to recover, he sought a new teaching position, but no institution would hire him. Determined to regain custody of his child, David realized he needed a purpose to survive. He repeatedly called his wife, but she ignored him. His lawyer warned that regaining custody was nearly impossible, as David, in his ruined state, was deemed an incapable parent. To rebuild his life, David joined an alcohol support group and took a menial job. When he met Cons again, she was genuinely happy to witness his positive transformation. David assumed the death penalty abolition organization would welcome him back, but they did not. Cons received a call from them stating David could no longer participate, deeming him unworthy of their noble cause. Those words pierced David deeply, proving that no matter his efforts, reality had definitively defeated him. That night, he tried calling his son, but his wife snatched the phone and hung up. Losing his son broke David completely. The next day, he went to Cons' house seeking solace, but she suddenly collapsed. Rushed to the hospital, David learned she had advanced cancer, which only deepened his despair. Betsy, moved by the story, began to believe in David's innocence. Given their close relationship, he had no conceivable motive to harm Cons. However, upon returning to her hotel with the cash for the lawyer, Betsy found her room unlocked. Summoning her courage, she entered and saw a videotape hanging from the ceiling, labeled for her. Realizing it was likely connected to the case, she nervously played it. As she had feared, it depicted Cons' death. She was lying on the floor, hands cuffed behind her back, a sealed plastic bag over her head, struggling in agony before ultimately succumbing to suffocation. Betsy had imagined this scene, but witnessing it was still utterly horrifying. She could not fathom the depth of Cons' suffering, but she fully grasped the sheer horror of that death. She also began to suspect David was not the real killer. David and Cons had worked tirelessly to abolish the death penalty. Perhaps the real culprit opposed their mission, killed Cons, and framed David. But if the tape came from the killer, why release it now? After breakfast, Betsy decided to first deliver the cash to David's lawyer and then conduct the final interview. At that very moment, the mysterious cowboy appeared again. His poor attempt at tracking them was blatantly obvious. The assistant tried to note his license plate number, but the cowboy turned a corner and vanished. Betsy's assistant then revealed that a top-tier lawyer had once offered to defend David pro bono, but David had chosen his current, incompetent counsel instead. What could have been a reduced sentence at the initial trial ended as a death penalty verdict due to this lawyer's inadequate defense. At the lawyer's office, Betsy handed over the $500,000 and informed him about the videotape. The lawyer responded that the tape was inadmissible as evidence because it was merely a fragment with no visible faces, making its authenticity impossible to verify. Betsy was disappointed, having hoped it could help overturn the case. Leaving the office, she headed back to the prison for the final interview. But on the first floor she spotted the mysterious cowboy. Suspecting a connection to the lawyer, she ran out to tell her assistant, who decided to follow the cowboy while she took a taxi back to the prison. After a frantic chase, the assistant failed to apprehend him but managed to record the license plate. Meanwhile, Betsy began her final conversation with David. Upon mentioning the cowboy, David immediately guessed his identity. The cowboy was actually a member of the death penalty abolition group, but he was extreme and obsessive, and he harbored a deep, unrequited affection for Cons. Betsy suddenly realized, could the cowboy be the real killer? David didn't answer directly but continued his story. After learning of Cons' cancer, David had fallen into absolute despair, drinking daily and neglecting everything, consumed by thoughts of his son. Cons, by contrast, continued to pursue her goals with unwavering determination despite her setbacks. After repeated failures, however, she had never successfully saved a single death row inmate, and her health was deteriorating rapidly. One night, during a moment of profound vulnerability, she confided in David that she was nearing death and regretted all the things she had left undone. Seeing his lifelong friend in such pain, David promised to stay by her side until the very end. That night, the two shared an intimate moment like lovers, clinging to each other and expressing their shared frustrations. The next morning, the cowboy knocked on Cons' door, and that was when she was killed. David, unaware of any of this, had returned to his former home, clutching his son's toy and lost in memory. Soon after, the new owners came out and evicted him. That night, he spent curled up in his car, only to be arrested later for Cons' murder. Betsy had finally heard David's full story and was now certain the cowboy was the true killer. Analyzing his motive, it seemed a jealous hatred of David had driven him. The horrifying tape had likely been sent deliberately, and finding the full video was the only way to exonerate David. Betsy complained that David hadn't reached out for help sooner, but he said his true goal wasn't to clear his name. It was to have Betsy record his story. He did not care about surviving. He only wanted his son to not remember him as a monstrous man. Watching David be led away, Betsy was overwhelmed with emotion but knew she had to gather evidence immediately. Realizing that David's execution was imminent, she felt a surge of panic. That night, she pored over the case files and reviewed the tape repeatedly, but found no new breakthroughs. The next morning, groggy and exhausted, she picked up a towel and suddenly realized the key detail. She woke her assistant, and they rushed to Cons' house to reconstruct the death. Betsy had noticed on the tape that at the very beginning, Cons' foot twitched, showing she was conscious, but she did not struggle until approximately 15 seconds later. Clearly, if she were being murdered, she would have fought from the very start. To test her theory, Betsy experimented on herself, placing a plastic bag over her head and sealing it. 15 seconds later, she was nearly overcome by suffocation. Her experiment revealed the truth. The gloves at the scene had been used, but were neatly placed aside, a typical housewife's habit. If someone else had used them, they would have been discarded carelessly. The handcuffing and swallowing of the key ensured that self-preservation instincts wouldn't interfere, while the plastic bag guaranteed death. Cons' suicide was motivated by her ultimate dedication to abolishing the death penalty. Facing terminal cancer, she chose to use her remaining time to achieve her life's unfulfilled goal. The assistant asked why she would frame David if she intended to die, and Betsy explained it was the cornerstone of her plan. Recording the truth meant that after David's execution, the footage would reveal the real story, creating a monumental scandal to fuel the abolitionist cause. The Texas governor had said that proving even one wrongly condemned death row inmate could trigger the abolition of the death penalty. The person helping Cons was the obsessive cowboy whose extreme actions, while effective, made David the perfect scapegoat. Betsy realized the full tape must be with the cowboy and began formulating a plan. It was 4:50 p.m. With just over an hour until David's execution, she needed that remaining footage to save him. Having personally felt the terror of suffocation, she could not stand by and watch an innocent man die. Using the license plate number, the assistant located the cowboy's address and initiated a distraction plan. The assistant called to lure the cowboy out, and once he left, Betsy sneaked into his house to search. As expected, she found the complete tape. The video confirmed all their deductions. Cons had acted entirely on her own, and after she suffocated, the cowboy appeared in the frame and turned off the camera. Seeing this, Betsy broke down in tears, stunned once more by Khan's sacrifice as they hurriedly left. The cowboy watched them calmly from the shadows. With only 8 minutes left until the execution, Betsy had to deliver the evidence immediately. She instructed her assistant to notify everyone by phone while she drove to the prison, but unexpectedly the rental car broke down halfway there. Desperate, Betsy had no choice but to run toward the prison on foot. Meanwhile, the execution chamber was buzzing with activity, packed with reporters and spectators. Before his final walk, David was served his last meal, 2 pancakes and a chocolate, the breakfast he had once promised to make for his son, now presented in the most tragic of circumstances. No one knew he was thinking of his child, and no one could feel his utter helplessness and pain. By the time Betsy arrived, exhausted from her desperate sprint, David had already been injected with the lethal poison and executed. Though David was dead, his story did not end there. Betsy immediately made the videotape public, and the truth ignited a national firestorm. The shocking revelation spread like wildfire across every major media outlet. Everyone now knew that Khan's had committed suicide and that David had been wrongfully executed. Overnight, a powerful nationwide movement to abolish the death penalty surged forward, fulfilling Khan's ultimate goal indirectly through David's death. Meanwhile, a hidden secret was quietly unfolding. Police searched the cowboy's residence on suspicion of being an accomplice, but found him long gone. The cowboy had taken the $500,000 from David's lawyer and quietly flown to Spain. What role did he truly play in the case? Was there another hidden layer to this story? The cowboy arrived at an apartment in Spain and placed the $500,000 at the door. When the door opened, a woman was astonished by what she saw. This woman was none other than David's ex-wife. She handed her lover David's coat and opened the box to find $500,000 inside, along with a postcard from the female student apologizing. Only then did she realize that David had been innocent all along. Meanwhile, back at the newsroom, Betsy received a package containing a toy and a letter. The note explained that the toy held a key to freedom. Instantly, Betsy recalled David's words and, unsurprisingly, discovered a box of videotapes inside it. She hurriedly locked herself in a room and began watching. After the cowboy left on the new tape, another man appeared, a figure so familiar that Betsy dared not guess. Yet the reality became clearer and harsher. David was seen touching Khan's head, deliberately leaving his fingerprints. It turned out that David himself had orchestrated the entire event. He had willingly sacrificed his life, using his death to fulfill Khan's dream and to conclude his own brief, tragic life. The key to freedom was also David's final gift to Betsy, helping her release the guilt and self-blame for failing to save him. One of the film's lingering questions is that David could have ensured the abolition of the death penalty in the final minutes without sacrificing himself. So why did he still choose to die? Share your thoughts in the comments below.